Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Perfect. I'm going to be presenting this paper called Post-Meeting Curation of Whiteboard Content Captured with Mobile Devices. Fancy title, took us a while to come up with it. And my name is Danny. I'm going to be presenting this paper that I worked on in collaboration with Dr. Jen, Dr. Ed Rc, and Dr. Stacey Scott. And I'm the guy standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to make this interesting. This is a collaboration between the University of Waterloo as well as Smart Technologies. Smart Technologies was the original creator of the Smartboard. So the research question that we wanted to answer with this paper was, what do people do with whiteboard photos after a meeting? So let's back up here for a second. Imagine a few of us have a meeting, and we end that meeting and we sketch some stuff on the whiteboard. And what happens to that? What do people do with that content on the whiteboard? Now, we know that a lot of people take photos of it, so I'm sure a lot of you guys have done that. But then what? What do people do with that photo? And that's what this research paper is about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the introduction. I'll do a look at the background, talk about the study, how we analyze the data, the results, and what this means for design. And then I'll wrap it up with the contributions that this paper makes. So whiteboard research is actually a staple in the field of human-computer interaction, as you have seen several papers here in this session here today. A lot of the work was done in Xerox PARC a few decades ago. However, one of the things that we found was that most of the research on whiteboard is actually about what happens during the meeting. Not what happens after, not what happens before, but what happens during the meeting. And this is where our research study comes in. It's like, we don't know very much about what happens after the meeting and how can we support that part of the collaboration. So in looking at the background, we wanted to see whether there was research out there that could help us inform how we were about to conduct this. And one of the bodies of literatures that we found was the PIM, which is Personal Information Management. And they had a whole section here about how people manage like personal photos, the ones that you may take from like a trip on your vacations or something like that. Because at the end of the day, a whiteboard photo is a photo. So do people manage whiteboard photos the same way that they manage like photos from a vacation? Or is there more to it? Foreshadowing, there is. And the other thing that we looked at here is like, okay, let's put aside the fact that it's a whiteboard photo. Let's just look at the research that has been done on whiteboards themselves. And one of the research that was really important to this paper was actually from Tony Tang. He found that there was 4 types of whiteboards: intimate, the stuff that you may have maybe at home in your room that only you see; personal whiteboards, the stuff that you may have in your office, for example; and shared, something that you may have in like a war room that you have with your team, as well as a public whiteboard. Public whiteboard is something you may find in like a classroom or that you may find in like a conference room. And this research was really important in our research because we kind of realized that the only whiteboard photos that exist out there, for the most part, are the ones that come out of shared and public whiteboards. So people don't really take pictures of personal stuff, of personal whiteboards that they have in their office because it's right there. There's not going to be erased. It's mostly the stuff that comes out of meetings. And that's why we focus the research question in what do people do with whiteboard photos after a meeting. And we wanted to know whether there was already technology out there that could that was already supporting this, of what happens after a meeting. And there wasn't very much, but what we found could technically be classified under one of these 4 here, which are interactive whiteboards, such as the stuff that the whiteboards that Smart Technologies and Microsoft and now the Google Jam produce. There were some capture systems, which is actually really interesting, where you have a regular whiteboard, then you have a camera on the ceiling that points at the whiteboard and it's recording everything that you're doing. As well as with the rise of mobile, you now have a bunch of applications that could also help you with your whiteboarding session during and after as well. And I talk about these because some of the implications for later are going to touch on these 3 types of whiteboard systems. So then our study was about 19 semi-structured interviews, and we wanted to talk to people from as many different backgrounds as possible. And so we interviewed a bunch of people who use whiteboards very often, because we were not interested in people who used whiteboards just once in a blue moon. So the heavy users of whiteboards. And we had CEOs, we had marketing professionals, we had designers as well. And some of these came from big companies like Google and Microsoft. Some other ones came from startups. So pretty diverse sample of folks here. And these were mostly, the interviews were mostly done in person, near where they were working or where that whiteboard was, those meeting rooms were. They were between 20 and 60 minutes, and they were audio and video recorded. And the stuff that we talked about during the interview were the stuff that we were interested in, such as how do people capture, how do people share, how do people store, how do they archive, how do they search for these whiteboard photos, how do they revisit them, and what purpose do whiteboard photos fill in their life or in their daily work. And the way we analyzed these 19 interviews was using Thematic Analysis, which some of you may be familiar with. And the way you do it is you familiarize yourself with the data. You start coming up with codes. You generate themes for that, and it's an iterative process. And by the end, you're able to generate a report with all the themes and the stuff that you found using the thematic analysis. And to help us with that, we transcribed all the interviews using rev.com, which is, by the way, it's really cheap. If you ever need to transcribe interviews, go to rev.com. It's awesome. And we put that data into NVivo, which is a qualitative tool in which I highly recommend. It's pretty useful when you're doing qualitative analysis, and that's how we use the thematic analysis. And jumping into the results here, what do people do with whiteboard photos after a meeting? So I'm going to try to start here from the beginning. The most common thing that we knew people do is that they take photos of these things that they created during a meeting. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of people didn't know whether that whiteboard content that they put on the whiteboard was going to be really useful later. So people just took pictures of it just in case. And that created an issue where a lot of people had tons of these whiteboard photos that they never actually used afterwards. And I see some people nodding their heads like, oh yeah, I have a ton of those. And the next most common thing that people did with these whiteboard photos after they captured them was actually transferring them to another device. Rarely do people work on whiteboard photos from their phone, which is what they were using to capture it. And they transferred it to themselves. So they sent it to themselves. They rarely ever shared it to other people from here, which is a little bit of a surprising finding. And there were some pain points around the transferring, such as, you have to open an email, you have to send it to yourself, then you have to, if you're going to store it somewhere else, you have to rename it. So people thought there was a little bit of a pain in order to do that. And if you're going to walk away with anything, if you're going to remember anything about this presentation from today, it's this slide right here. The number one thing, or the thing why people use and take whiteboard photos, is to create another document, which is often a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document or an email or something like that, which we called a superseding document. And we're using this term because after this document was created, the whiteboard photo rarely had any value afterwards. People rarely ever used it. And it was the main purpose of having that photo was to enable that person to create another document afterwards. And because of this, we found that it had a very fleeting, very momentary value, these whiteboard photos. If you were to ask people, tell me a little bit about your whiteboard photos and why you value in them, most people said that they don't really care about their whiteboard photos, only the most recent ones. And that makes sense because, again, they're using these whiteboard photos mostly to create a document. So photos that they had from 6 months ago, from a year ago, people didn't really care about them. If they had used them, then they probably already had transcribed them into another document. And if they hadn't used them, well, they were never useful in the first place. However, there were some special photos that did not follow this pattern. They were very unique, and there's a little bit more on that in the paper. And one of the things that we did during the interviews is that we asked people to describe to us, tell me a little bit about one recent whiteboard photo that you can really remember all the steps that you took in. And they described to us in very detailed, and we were able to draw out these maps of what people did. So for example, this one here, there was a meeting and somebody took a photo and they emailed it to themselves and they made some notes and they sent it to the attendees and they added it to Asana, and later they created a report. And we were able to do this with about 20 or so of these photos that people described. And we wanted to see whether there was any common pattern or share pattern in the way that people were using these photos. And it turns out that there was a 7-stage process in which people typically use these whiteboard photos. And it's they initially capture, like we were talking about earlier. They would then transfer it. That was the next most common thing that people would do. And they would extract some of that information for that whiteboard photo. But here it was for the purpose of establishing evidence of what they talked about during the meeting. So typically those would be in an email. They would put in an email with some of the notes that would summarize it, and they would send it out to the team. Sometimes they would attach the whiteboard photo to the email. Sometimes they didn't. And if they were to do anything with it afterwards, because oftentimes they just kind of stop there, but if they did anything with the whiteboard after that, it was typically to store it in like a shared drive somewhere. And then if they did anything with it after that, it would be to extract it and create that superseding document that we were talking about earlier, which could be, again, a PowerPoint, some other type of document. And the last stage here is actually non-action, which means after they created a superseding document, the most common thing they did is forget about it, never work on it again. So they basically just kind of forgot about it. And we also found that there was few participants who used whiteboard photos in a very interesting way that didn't resemble any of the other participants that we talked to. And it's not that the photos that they create or the way they used those photos was different or didn't follow the pattern that we just described. Is that it had extra steps. So for example, this one participant, before taking that photo of that whiteboard, he would go up to the whiteboard when the meeting was done and he would clean it up and make it all nice so that when he took the photo, it was pretty ready to go. So there was extra steps in the way they took that whiteboard photo, but it still generally followed that pattern that I just described. And one thing that I was really excited about with this research was that about 7 of the people that we talked to, we actually had footage of them and from a meeting that they had about, I think it was 4 months before we were able to talk to them. So we could ask them questions about that meeting to see how much they remembered about that meeting. And we asked them questions about, who was there, what they wrote. And this is useful to know because if you were ever designing a type of search engine to find whiteboard photos, you want to know what people remember the most and use those as search queries. So we wanted to know what is it that people remember the most. And it turns out the stuff that people remember about previous meeting in which they used a whiteboard tends to be the general meeting stuff, such as who was there, what time was the meeting, what were they talking about. They did not remember very specific things. Like if you were to ask them, do you remember what colors were used? Like was it a red color, a green color? These are things that people typically didn't remember. They didn't remember what side of the whiteboard was used, whether they could describe specific diagrams that were written in it. So these would make very poor search queries if you're ever designing a system like this. And thinking a little bit about what does this mean? Like if you were to design some type of technology in order to support what people do with whiteboard photos after a meeting. So I'm going to break it down into the several types of applications that I talked about in the beginning. For example, mobile-centric. Where mobile-centric applications to really come in is making the quick capture really easily. And the key here is that it's got to be quicker than what you can already do on your phone. With your phone, you can just kind of pull it out and take a picture. If it takes any more than that, some systems then people are basically not going to use it. As well as auto renaming the photo, like I talked about earlier. People don't just store that photo as photo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They usually give it a meaningful name to it. And auto transferring, like we know that the most common thing that people do is transfer it to themselves, usually by email. So there's some opportunities here. For desktop-centric applications, again, the one place where it could really make a difference is helping people extract that information from that whiteboard photo. Since we know that's what they do, they're creating that superseding document. So how can we enable that? And for whiteboard-centric applications for companies like Smart Technologies or Microsoft or Google, this provides a very unique way to support that secondary purpose of taking a whiteboard, which is establishing an evidence that the meeting happened or what we agreed on, because whiteboards, electronic whiteboards are going to be there during the entire meeting. So they can record to some extent how the meeting unfolded. So they have an opportunity to essentially provide ways of establishing a form of evidence of what was agreed on during the meeting in a much better way than just taking a photo at the end, which is just, can't see what happened during the meeting. So imagine, for example, if an electronic whiteboard was able to tell who wrote what on the whiteboard. If there's ever a disagreement between you and I about, no, that's not not what we talked about, that's not what we agreed on, then something like this, would you be able to go back and be able to say, oh yeah, that's what we agreed on. That's right, you wrote that. And just to finish up here with the contributions of the paper, we have empirical evidence of how people use whiteboard photos, and evidence that is very different from how people use personal photos. Memory recall, like I was talking about earlier, what are some of the things that people remember really well about whiteboard photos or a meeting in which they had and they used a whiteboard? A new model for how they used whiteboard photos that is different again from how people use regular photos, and some design implications about what this means for research as well as companies out there developing technologies for this. Thank you.
Okay. Again, state your name and affiliation before asking questions.
I don't know what's for lunch, if that's what you're asking.
No. Bruno Fouchard from Telecom Paritech. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I liked your approach. I had just one question. So I saw some people take pictures today of this thing, of the presentations. And I was just wondering if you thought that your results could also apply to this kind of case. Because it's not a meeting, but I think the process is quite the same. That is like listening to people and reacting also together, or sometimes with questions. So do you think that the results you had, the outcomes, could apply also to this kind of context?
So to rephrase the question, you're asking me if if the way people use whiteboard photos would be similar to the way people would use a photo of this, of like a presentation like this?
Yeah.
Probably. If I were to guess, I would say probably not, mostly because whiteboard photos are usually, they're coming out of a collaboration, something that we worked on together. I think the photos from this would probably resemble more of like what happens when you go on vacation and you take photos of stuff that wasn't really a product of some collaboration or something that you need to do with it. So I highly doubt that anybody's gonna take the photos from this and like create a document or presentation or something like that. Maybe if they're doing some kind of report, but I think for the most part it may be quite different. Great question, thank you.
Thank you.
Fabrice Bachulik, Preferred Networks, former postdoc at Waterloo. So I'm wondering at the more fundamental question that your research shows that I think most people here who have photograph whiteboards know the results pretty much. But what does it tell about the actual meeting, right? What is the reason was the meeting not successful if people were not looking for information about the meeting? Was it more a technological problem that people were not able to retrieve the information that they wanted because it was in a photo, in a lost Word document? I was wondering if you actually researched those more fundamental questions about was the purpose of the meeting fulfilled, or is it more a technological problem? I think that would be more interesting.
That's a great question, and I can partially answer some of that. So it turns out that people don't really have a problem retrieving whiteboard photos, usually because they're going back to them pretty recently after the meeting. It's not like they're going back to them 6 months later. So if you had a meeting a few days ago, you usually remember where it is. It's going to be somewhere in the last few photos in your camera roll, or perhaps the last few emails that you sent to yourself. So that's not an issue. The other question that you had, though, whether the meeting was successful depending on what they do with that whiteboard photo. Well, there's many types of meetings. You can have a meeting with me and you're trying to explain me some code maybe, in which for you, that information is not useful because it's all in your head, right? For me, it may be useful, so I may take a picture of it so I can reference to it later. However, if we're having a meeting with several people, chances are that what we're gonna create on the whiteboard is gonna be a collaboration of your thoughts, my thoughts, someone else's thoughts. It doesn't exist, or it doesn't live in anybody's one head. So having a photo of that is really important, because it's hard for you to walk away from a meeting like that, be able to remember everything. So just keep in mind that if a meeting is for the purpose of creation, like innovation, that is where whiteboard photos really come in. Remember how I was talking about earlier about special whiteboard photos? There was some type of whiteboard photos where if we're coming up with a new product or designing something new and it's just kind of happened in the meeting and something beautiful was created, those whiteboard photos tend to be really special, and they didn't follow the general pattern that all the other ones, that most whiteboard photos would have. So that, yes, that tells you a little bit about how successful or what type of meeting it was.
Hi,
Hello.
My name is Purna. I'm from the University of Notre Dame. This was very interesting. So I have a question. Did you like happen to study these in particular contexts, or like do you plan to study these? Because like for example, there have been studies where they've studied programmers' work habits, and they find that when programmers like use whiteboards for problem solving or collaborations, they also have this thing where they attach the photos taken to the respective code segments in the IDEs to enhance the readability of their code. So, like, I think there's a context sensitive thing to this as well.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. And I actually found some of the same thing, because some of the people we talked to were working with developers or were developers themselves. We did see instances of that. And what we were trying to do with this study was trying to provide a more general model that wasn't context specific, but was more general. And some of these steps do reflect that. So we see that people sometimes would attach it to something else, or they would add it to a work item or a bug or something they were trying to affix. And we didn't get into specifics or any type of verticals, but we had people from all walks of life type of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank the speaker. And before closing the session, I was asked you